I have presided over hundreds of courtroom cases during my career. I have sentenced criminals. I have listened to grieving families. I have watched innocent people fight for justice. But there was one woman who walked into my courtroom believing she was untouchable. And believe me, what happened next is something I still remember years later. The case appeared ordinary at first, a civil dispute, nothing unusual. No major headlines, no violent crime, no shocking allegations. At least that's what I thought when I opened the file. I was wrong, very wrong. The moment the parties entered my courtroom, I noticed something disturbing. Not evidence, not testimony. Body language. Years on the bench teach you how to read people long before they open their mouths. The plaintiff entered first, a middle-aged contractor named Daniel Brooks, simple suit, nervous posture, tired eyes. The kind of man who looked like he had not slept properly in weeks. He carried a thick folder against his chest. His hands were shaking slightly. Interesting, very interesting, because innocent people often fear courtrooms. Not because they are guilty, because they are afraid nobody will believe them. Then the defendant entered, and suddenly the entire atmosphere changed. Her name was Karen Whitmore. She was wealthy, very wealthy, Dastar clothing, perfect hair. Expensive jewelry, the kind of confidence money often creates. But what caught my attention wasn't her appearance. It was her smile. A smile that never seemed appropriate for a courtroom. I remember looking at her and thinking, why does she seem entertained? Most defendants arrive worried, concerned, anxious. Karen looked amused, as if the entire legal process was beneath her. Then I noticed her husband, Michael Whitmore, and that was when my instincts began screaming. Because while Karen looked relaxed, Michael looked terrified, not nervous. Terrified, there is a difference, a very big difference. His face had lost color. His hands remained clasped together. He barely spoke. He avoided eye contact with everyone, especially his wife. Interesting, very interesting. At that moment, I didn't know why, but I knew something wasn't right. The hearing began. Both attorneys introduced themselves. The plaintiff's attorney stood first. He explained that Daniel Brooks had completed extensive renovation work on the Whitmore family's luxury property. According to the complaint, Daniel had never been paid. The amount exceeded $180,000, a significant sum. The kind of money that could destroy a small business. Karen immediately rolled her eyes. Interesting, very interesting, because most people accused of withholding nearly $200,000 show concern. Karen looked annoyed, almost offended that she was required to sit there. The attorney continued. Daniel had hired workers, purchased materials, completed the project, submitted invoices, and then nothing. No payment, no explanation, no response. The jury listened carefully. I watched Karen. Not once did she look toward Daniel. Not once. Years on the bench teach you something important. People often avoid looking at those they believe they have harmed. Then Karen's attorney stood, and everything became even more interesting. According to the defense, Daniel Brooks was incompetent, unprofessional, dishonest. Karen's attorney painted him as a man desperately trying to exploit a successful family. I watched Daniel carefully. His reaction surprised me. He didn't look angry. He didn't look offended. He looked defeated, as though he had heard these accusations many times before. Interesting, very interesting. Then came the moment that changed everything. Karen requested permission to speak. That alone caught my attention. Experienced attorneys rarely want their clients speaking freely, especially wealthy clients, especially arrogant clients. I granted permission, and Karen stood. The courtroom became quiet. I remember every word she said, because those words would ultimately destroy her case. She looked directly at me, smiled, then laughed, actually laughed. Inside my courtroom, several jurors exchanged glances. The spectators shifted in their seats. Even her attorney looked uncomfortable. Then Karen spoke. "Judge, this whole thing is ridiculous." Silence. She pointed toward Daniel. "That man wants money he didn't earn." More silence. Then she looked directly at me again and said the sentence nobody in that courtroom expected. "Honestly, Judge." Pause, a smug smile. "You don't scare me." The courtroom froze, completely froze. Years on the bench teach you how to remain calm. Inside, however, I became curious, not angry. Curious because people who believe rules don't apply to them often reveal far more than they realize. The jury reacted immediately. The spectators reacted. Even her attorney lowered his head. But the most interesting reaction came from one person, her husband, Michael Whitmore. The color drained from his face. He looked horrified, as though he knew something Karen didn't, as though he knew she had just made a terrible mistake. And that was when I realized something. Michael wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of what Karen might say next. That realization stayed with me because over the next several hours, I would discover a secret buried beneath this dispute. A secret involving hidden emails, forged approvals, missing money, and one piece of evidence that nearly caused the entire courtroom to erupt. But at that moment, I had no idea how deep this story went. I only knew one thing. The terrified look on Michael Whitmore's face was not the face of a man worried about losing a lawsuit. It was the face of a man worried that the truth was about to come out. And when the first email appeared on the courtroom screen, I finally understood why. I have spent decades listening to testimony, thousands of witnesses, thousands of stories. And one thing I've learned is this: people rarely fear the truth. They fear evidence. That morning, when Karen Whitmore boldly announced that I didn't scare her, I wasn't interested in her attitude. I was interested in her husband. Because while Karen looked amused, Michael Whitmore looked like a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. And believe me, I have learned never to ignore that kind of fear. The plaintiff's attorney approached the evidence screen slowly, confidently, almost too confidently. Interesting, very interesting. Experienced attorneys only move that way when they know something the other side doesn't. The courtroom became silent. The first email appeared. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, a simple communication between Daniel Brooks and Karen Whitmore. Nothing dramatic, nothing shocking. Then I started reading, and so did the jury. The email contained Karen's direct approval for expensive renovation changes, additional flooring, custom cabinetry, luxury fixtures, all approved in writing. Interesting, very interesting, because moments earlier, Karen's attorney had argued the exact opposite. According to the defense, Daniel had performed unauthorized work. Yet here was written evidence showing Karen personally approving those same changes. I looked toward Karen. She wasn't smiling anymore. Not quite, but she still appeared confident, too confident. Then I looked toward Michael. His hands tightened. Interesting. The attorney displayed another email, then another, then another. Every single message told the same story. Karen requesting upgrades, Karen approving expenses, Karen demanding additional work, Karen asking for faster completion. The jury noticed. I noticed. Everyone noticed. The defendant's attorney looked increasingly uncomfortable. And honestly, so did Karen. But then something happened, something that immediately grabbed my attention. The plaintiff's attorney stopped, paused, and said, "Your Honor, I would like to display Exhibit 14. Interesting, very interesting, because lawyers rarely announce evidence dramatically unless they know its importance. The courtroom screen changed. A new email appeared. This one looked different, immediately different. I leaned forward. The jury did too. The message appeared to come from Daniel Brooks. According to the defense, this email supposedly proved Daniel admitted the work was unauthorized. In fact, the entire defense case relied heavily on it. Interesting, very interesting, because until that moment, it had seemed like one of Karen's strongest pieces of evidence. Then the attorney asked a simple question. "Mrs. Whitmore," pause. "Did you submit this email to the court?" Karen nodded. "Yes." The attorney nodded back, then asked, "And you're certain it's authentic?" Karen smiled, confident again. "Absolutely. Interesting, very interesting." Years on the bench teach you something important. Overconfidence is dangerous, especially under oath. The attorney clicked a button. The screen changed. Suddenly, the jury wasn't looking at the email itself. They were looking at metadata, technical records, server information, transmission details. Most spectators looked confused, but I wasn't. I've seen digital evidence destroy cases before. The attorney pointed toward a timestamp, then toward an IP address, then toward a server log. And suddenly the entire courtroom became very quiet, very quiet. The attorney spoke carefully. According to independent forensic analysis, pause. This email was never sent from Daniel Brooks. Dead silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Interesting, very interesting. Karen's confidence vanished. Immediately, the attorney continued. This email originated from a device registered to the Whitmore residence. The courtroom exploded into whispers. I immediately called for order. But the damage was done. The jury had heard it. The spectators had heard it. Karen had heard it. Most importantly, Michael had heard it. And that's when something happened that I will never forget. I watched Michael Whitmore lower his head, slowly, painfully, almost like a man carrying a secret too heavy to hold any longer. Interesting, very interesting, because innocent people usually react differently. Michael looked defeated, not surprised. Defeated. The attorney wasn't finished. Not even close. A second forensic report appeared, then a third, then a fourth. Each one pointed toward the same conclusion. The email had been fabricated, not mistaken, not misunderstood. Fabricated. Someone had created false evidence. Someone had submitted it to the court. Someone had committed a very serious offense. I looked directly at Karen. For the first time all morning, she looked worried, actually worried. Then I looked toward Michael, and what I saw disturbed me. Because he wasn't looking at the evidence. He wasn't looking at the attorneys. He wasn't even looking at me. He was staring at his wife, and the expression on his face wasn't fear anymore. It was disappointment, deep disappointment. The kind that comes from watching someone destroy themselves. Years on the bench teach you how to recognize regret, and Michael Whitmore looked like a man drowning in it. Then the plaintiff's attorney said something that changed the entire direction of the case, something nobody expected, something that made Karen immediately jump to her feet. The attorney looked toward the jury, then toward me, then toward Michael Whitmore and said, "Your Honor, pause. We have evidence that Mr. Whitmore repeatedly warned his wife not to submit this email." The courtroom froze. Karen's face turned white. Michael closed his eyes. And suddenly I realized this case was no longer about unpaid invoices. It was becoming something much bigger, much darker. Because if Michael had warned Karen, then Michael knew exactly how that email had been created. And when the attorney announced he had recordings to prove it, Karen screamed one word so loudly that the entire courtroom jumped. I have heard people shout in court before. I've heard anger, I've heard grief, I've heard panic. But when Karen Whitmore suddenly screamed from her seat, the sound wasn't anger. It was fear, real fear. The kind that appears when someone realizes a secret is no longer secret. The entire courtroom froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Karen immediately stood up. Her chair slid backward. Her face had gone completely pale. Interesting, very interesting, because just minutes earlier she had been smiling, mucking, confident. Now she looked terrified. I looked toward Michael. His eyes remained closed, almost as if he already knew what was coming. Years on the bench teach you something important. When people know the truth is inevitable, they often stop fighting. Michael Whitmore looked exactly like that. The plaintiff's attorney remained calm, very calm. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. "Your Honor, pause. The recording was made 6 months before this lawsuit was filed." Interesting, very interesting. Because that meant this wasn't a reaction. This wasn't something created after litigation began. This was evidence that existed long before anyone entered my courtroom. The attorney pressed play, and suddenly the speakers came alive. The first voice belonged to Michael Whitmore, immediately recognizable, calm, concerned, nervous. The courtroom listened carefully. Then Michael said something that made the jury lean forward. "Karen, don't send that email." Dead silence. Interesting, very interesting. Then Karen's voice appeared, sharp, annoyed, dismissive. "What are you talking about?" Michael answered immediately. "Because it's fake." The courtroom froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I looked toward Karen. She stared at the table, not the screen, not the jury. The table, interesting. Years on the bench teach you another lesson. People often avoid looking at evidence they know is true. The recording continued. Michael sounded increasingly desperate. "You can't submit that." Pause. "They'll find out." Karen laughed. Actually laughed. The same laugh I had heard earlier in my courtroom. And honestly, that bothered me, because arrogance sounds very different when it's recorded. The jury noticed it too. The recording continued. Karen said, "They won't find anything." Pause. "I've already checked." The courtroom became even quieter. Interesting, very interesting, because suddenly we weren't discussing an accident. We weren't discussing confusion. We were discussing planning, deliberate planning, the worst kind. The plaintiff's attorney allowed the recording to continue. Michael spoke again. This time his voice cracked, a detail I noticed immediately. People rarely fake fear successfully, and Michael sounded genuinely afraid. "You could get arrested." Long silence, then Karen answered, "I'll be fine." Pause. "They always believe me." Dead silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I remember looking toward the jury. Several jurors exchanged glances. Not good at all, because confidence can help a witness. Arrogance destroys one. Karen's recorded words were doing exactly that. The recording continued. Then Michael said something unexpected, something that changed everything. Daniel doesn't deserve this. Interesting, very interesting, because until now, everyone assumed Michael had simply followed his wife's lead. Suddenly, it sounded different. Very different. Karen immediately interrupted him, and what she said next shocked the courtroom. He should have known better than to challenge me. Dead silence. The words hung in the air, heavy, uncomfortable, dangerous. I watched Daniel Brooks, the contractor who had remained quiet throughout the hearing. For the first time all day, I saw anger, not explosive anger, not shouting. Something deeper, pain. Interesting, very interesting. Years on the bench teach you that betrayal often hurts more than loss. And Daniel looked betrayed. The attorney paused the recording, then approached Michael Whitmore carefully, slowly. He asked a simple question. Mr. Whitmore, pause. Did you know this email was fabricated? Long silence, very long silence. The entire courtroom waited. I waited, the jury waited. Even Karen waited. Then Michael answered. Yes. The room exploded. Gasps, whispers, shock. I immediately called for order. But once again, the damage was done. The truth was beginning to surface, and everyone could feel it. The attorney continued. Did you create the email? Michael shook his head. No, interesting. Very interesting. Then came the question nobody wanted to ask, the question Karen clearly feared. The attorney looked directly at Michael, then asked, who did? Long silence. Michael stared at the floor. His hands trembled. Karen looked terrified, actually terrified. And for the first time all day, she wasn't speaking. That alone told me something. Then Michael slowly lifted his head, looked directly toward the witness stand, and pointed, not at Daniel, not at the attorneys, not at me, at his own wife. The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Karen immediately jumped to her feet, screaming, crying, shouting, denying everything. But the most disturbing part wasn't her reaction. It was Michael's, because after pointing at his wife, he began crying. Quickly, like a man who had been carrying guilt for far too long. And when the attorney revealed that this wasn't the first document Karen had allegedly altered, I realized the case was about to become far bigger than anyone imagined. I have seen marriages collapse inside courtrooms before. I've seen business partnerships end. I've seen families torn apart by secrets. But what happened after Michael Whitmore pointed at his own wife was different, because this wasn't merely betrayal. This was exposure, the kind of exposure people spend years trying to avoid. Karen was still shouting when I called for order. Her voice echoed across the courtroom. She accused Michael of lying. She accused Daniel of manipulation. She accused the attorneys of conspiracy. Interesting, very interesting, because innocent people usually defend facts. Karen was attacking people. That's a very important difference. Years on the bench teach you that when evidence becomes overwhelming, some people stop fighting the facts and start fighting everyone around them. Karen had reached that stage. The jury noticed it. The spectators noticed it. And most importantly, Michael noticed it. The plaintiff's attorney waited patiently. He wasn't interrupting. He wasn't arguing. He simply allowed Karen to continue. A smart move. Very smart. Sometimes people reveal more while trying to defend themselves than any witness ever could. Eventually, Karen sat down, still furious, still shaking, still insisting everyone was against her. Then the attorney walked toward the evidence table and pulled out another folder, a thick folder. Interesting, very interesting, because experienced lawyers don't carry thick folders unless they contain something important, very important. The attorney opened it, then looked directly at Michael. Mr. Whitmore, pause. How many documents were altered? The courtroom froze. Interesting, Michael immediately lowered his head. Not a good sign, not a good sign at all. Then he answered quietly, more than one. Gasps filled the room. I remember watching the jury carefully. Several jurors stopped taking notes. Interesting, years on the bench teach you that when jurors stop writing, it often means they're processing something significant, something big. The attorney continued. How many? Long silence, very long silence. Then Michael answered, 5. The courtroom exploded. 5, not 1, not 2, 5 separate documents. Karen immediately stood again. That's not true. Interesting, very interesting. Because Michael wasn't arguing, he wasn't angry, he looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a secret for too long. The attorney displayed another document, then another, then another. Each one appeared legitimate, professional, convincing, but forensic analysis told a different story. Every document showed signs of manipulation, mod dates, changed signatures, altered approval records. Interesting, very interesting. And suddenly, Daniel Brooks' entire story began making sense. The unpaid invoices, the missing approvals, the financial damage, everything connected. The attorney then asked Michael a question that changed the emotional direction of the case. A question nobody expected. Why didn't you stop her? Dead silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I looked toward Michael, and honestly, what I saw affected me. Because for the first time all day, he looked broken, not scared, broken. Years on the bench teach you to recognize the difference. Fear looks forward. Regret looks backward. Michael looked like a man drowning in regret. Then he answered. I tried. Silence. The attorney waited. Michael continued. I tried for months. Pause. I begged her to stop. Very interesting, because suddenly Michael wasn't part of the deception. He was trapped inside it. The attorney asked, why stay silent? Long silence. Then Michael looked directly toward Daniel Brooks. And what he said next shocked everyone, including me, because Daniel saved my life. Dead silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Interesting. Very interesting. Because absolutely nobody expected that answer. The attorney looked surprised. The jury looked surprised. Even Karen looked surprised. Michael continued. Several years earlier, before any lawsuit existed, before any renovation project, before any financial dispute, Michael had suffered a serious accident. A construction accident. According to his testimony, he had fallen from scaffolding during a property inspection. He remembered almost nothing, except one detail, one person, Daniel Brooks, the contractor, the same man sitting across the courtroom. Daniel had pulled him to safety, called emergency services, stayed at the hospital, saved his life. Dead silence. I looked toward Daniel. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. Interesting, very interesting, the attorney asked. Did you tell your wife? Michael nodded, many times. Then came the question nobody expected. How did she respond? Long silence. Michael swallowed hard, then answered. She said I owed him nothing. The courtroom became colder, much colder. Because suddenly this wasn't just fraud. This wasn't just money. This was character. The jury felt it. I felt it. Everyone felt it. Then the attorney displayed one final piece of evidence. And honestly, I will never forget Karen's face when it appeared, because the document wasn't created by Daniel. It wasn't created by Michael. It wasn't created by any attorney. It was created by Karen herself, a private journal entry, one she never expected anyone to see. And when the first sentence appeared on the courtroom screen, Karen's entire world began to collapse.